The year was 340 BCE, and tensions between Rome and the Latins were at an all-time high. The Latins were beginning to feel as though Rome had become far too powerful for the two sides to be considered equals, and this power imbalance would lead to Rome fully asserting themselves as the overlords of the Latin cities. This was completely unacceptable to most of the Latin cities who had signed an earlier treaty, the Foedus Cassianum, in the hopes of securing Rome's protection against outside threats. While the treaty did certainly succeed in that metric, it would seem that the Latin cities had begun to trade their sovereignty in exchange for protection, something that they had not meant to do. With this realization, many Latin cities began to agitate for a full-scale war with Rome, where the Latin cities could finally put Rome back in its place as just another Latin city. Could the Latins succeed in such an undertaking? Would the entirety of Latium even support such a move? And how did we even get here in the first place? Let's talk about it. Now, before we can talk about the Great Latin War of 340 BCE, we actually need to rewind the clock just a little bit, to the year 383 BCE. In this year, a prominent Latin city, Lanuvium, rebelled against Roman rule. Lanuvium had been a settled Latin city for as long as the Latins had lived in Latium, and was a very influential and religiously important city. This revolt appears to have been in response to an earlier revolt by another Latin city, the city of Velitrae. The city of Velitrae had rebelled against Rome because they believed Rome had begun to encroach upon their territory by sending commissioners to distribute land and settle colonies within the Pontine marshes, an area that Velitrae apparently controlled. Rome, of course, was not going to allow such a rebellion to go unanswered, and quickly voted to declare war. However, apparently the city of Rome had some sort of disease going around that essentially made it impossible for an army to be put together, and so they were forced to wait. In the meantime, the rebelling cities had begun to raid Roman territory, and apparently managed to secure themselves quite a bit of loot. As if things couldn't get any worse for Rome, rumors began to circulate that the city of Praeneste had joined the rebellion, while Tusculum, Gabii, and Lanuvium, all Roman allies, complained that their territory was also being targeted by the rebelling cities. Finally, in 382, Rome managed to put together an army, under the leadership of Spurius Papyrus and Lucius Papyrus, two consular tribunes. The two tribunes would catch up to the army of Velitrae and quickly defeat them. We know next to nothing about this battle, but we do know that the Romans determined they could not storm the fortifications of Velitrae itself, and that they quickly realized that troops from Praeneste augmented the army of Velitrae. These reports made their way back to Rome, and the Senate quickly declared war on Praeneste in response. It was at this point that Livy tells us that Lanuvium fully joined in the rebellion. This likely represents a larger effort by the rebels to build a large coalition of Latin cities to defeat Rome. Remember that the treaty between Rome and the Latin League was signed with Rome being seen as an equal to all the Latin cities put together. Two cities, even two of the most powerful, were not going to be enough to defeat Rome. The success of this effort is slightly murky. Yes, they may have gotten Lanuvium, but it seems that at least for now, that was all the rebels were able to muster. In any case, Livy and Plutarch provide slightly differing accounts for the next year, 381 BCE. Both agree that the Volsci joined together with the rebelling Latin cities. The Volsci were, at least at the time, regular enemies of Rome, and so it really should be no surprise that they would be willing to join in an effort to cripple the Eternal City. This force, now mainly made up of troops from Praeneste and the Volsci, took the Roman colony of Satricum. In response, the Romans sent an army under the command of Marcus Furius Camillus and Lucius Furius Medillinus to prosecute the war. Marcus was the main general and was granted a special senatorial decree to oversee the war with the Volsci. This is where the accounts of Livy and Plutarch really disagree. Livy tells us that the two men marched from the Esquiline Gate with an army of 4 legions, with each legion containing roughly 4,000 men, meaning an army of roughly 16,000. This army quickly made its way to Satricum, where it met the combined forces of the Volsci and Praeneste, which apparently significantly outnumbered the Romans. Marcus Camillus urged caution and refused to attack. This infuriated his apparently much younger colleague Lucius Furius, who believed Marcus to be too old and too cautious. This argument apparently began to pick up steam, and soon the whole of the army backed Lucius Furius in his belief that the Roman army should go to battle. Marcus Camillus, likely realizing it would be futile to argue at this point, formed a strong reserve to wait at the Roman camp to reinforce the Roman lines as needed. Lucius led the bulk of the army to battle the Volsci. However, the Volsci had planned for this and began to slowly retreat, baiting the Roman army into following them up a hillside. As soon as both armies were fighting on the hill, a reserve force of Volsci charged down the hill and into the Roman line. This position, fighting uphill, combined with the fresh Volscian troops, prompted the Roman army to flee. Marcus Camillus quickly roused his reserves into action and caught up to the fleeing Roman infantry. The infantry rallied to Marcus's side, while Lucius led the Roman cavalry into battle. This combined charge broke the Volscian line, and the Romans quickly took over the Volscian camp at the top of the hill, killing or capturing large numbers of enemy troops. Plutarch's account varies, in that Marcus Camillus, instead of being simply cautious, was actually quite sick before the battle started. However, upon hearing the Roman line was beginning to flee, he sprung from his couch and rallied the Roman troops enough to stop the enemy in their tracks and force their own retreat. The two armies then rested for a night before Marcus led his men into battle once more, and on the second day, the Roman army managed to defeat the Volscians. Sadly, at least for the Romans, they quickly realized that in the time they had been fighting with the Volscians, the Etruscans had managed to gain control of Satricum. Marcus again led his men into battle, and they managed to expel the Etruscans and retake the city. The events following this battle are also subject to two different accounts from Livy and Plutarch. Livy states that upon his return to Rome, Marcus Camillus found that his prisoners included men from the Latin city of Tusculum, a city that was supposedly still loyal to Rome. He brought this to the attention of the Senate, who quickly declared war upon Tusculum. Plutarch tells us that Marcus did not find any such prisoners, and that there was instead a rumor going around that Tusculum planned to rebel against Rome. In any case, Marcus was given the authority to prosecute a war against Tusculum. Apparently, Marcus quickly marched his army to Tusculum, where to his shock he found a city completely at peace. The citizens of the city went about their daily lives, and no army was to be found in the entire city. Marcus marched his army directly to the leading men of the city and ordered them to go to Rome and plead their case. The men, with the dictator of the city as their spokesperson, did just that. The men swore to the Senate that they had no plans for war and that they remained loyal to Rome. The Senate accepted their words and granted the city peace with full citizenship following shortly afterwards. It's hard to say which account we should accept, and even harder to say if either was or is true. The conduct of the war is probably once again broadly true. Plutarch is probably the closest to being correct, as Livy once again seems to write about the war with the typical Rome is so great attitude. The story of Tusculum, though, is harder to decipher. Is it possible that Rome annexed the city? Sure. Is it possible this was a peaceful affair? Again, sure. However, if we read a little bit between the lines, it seems to me that the Roman army was sent not in response to an invasion or possible rebellion, but instead as an occupying force. This would explain why Tusculum appeared to be in a state of peace, with no standing army ready. Maybe Rome simply jumped the gun and ordered Marcus to march to the city as a way of subjugating the population before any ideas of rebellion could take root. Or maybe Tusculum really did join the growing Roman state on their own volition. Whatever the case, I think we can fully agree that it was Rome that won this one. Our next clash comes in 380 BCE. During this year, Rome was supposed to undergo a census. This was typically a fairly streamlined process and normally non-controversial. This year, however, something went wrong. We aren't sure what exactly, but something happened that disrupted the process and delayed the census. This obstruction was led, or just taken advantage of, by the plebeian tribunes. The tribunes demanded debt relief for Rome's poorer citizens. This fight raged on, and eventually word spread to Rome's enemies. Praeneste, the city from before, decided that now was a good time to try and regain their honor, and possibly put Rome in its place. They quickly put together an army and marched into Roman territory. The tribunes, probably assuming that the army couldn't be that big of a deal, after all, hadn't Rome just beaten Praeneste and the Volsci, decided that they would block the creation of new legions until their debt relief plan was adopted. The two factions in Rome argued and argued, while the army of Praeneste advanced further and further into Roman territory. In fact, the army from Praeneste managed to make it all the way to the Porta Collina, or the Colline Gate, at the northern end of Rome itself. This seemingly snapped the two sides out of their conflict, and the Senate, with the approval of the tribunes, quickly appointed Titus Quinticus Pronius Cincinnatus, the son of the famous Cincinnatus, as dictator, with Allius Sempronius Artarnus as his master of the horse. With his new powers, Titus quickly put together a Roman army. The Praenestrians, seeing this new army begin to develop, pulled their forces back to Allia, the site of the famous battle between the Romans and the Gauls. This was done in the hope that the location would serve to create some sort of measure of dread among the Romans. It seemed, however, to have the opposite effect, and the Romans were excited to have a chance to wipe out their previous dishonor. The two sides quickly gave battle, with Titus making the first move. Titus ordered his master of the horse to charge the Roman cavalry directly into the Praenestrian line. This charge was so effective that the line broke nearly upon first contact, and their army quickly began a disorganized retreat. The Romans followed, and we are told that they chased them all the way back to Praeneste itself. At first, the Praenestines attempted to set up a second camp to deny Rome the countryside, but before they were able to do so, the Romans charged once again. This charge forced the Praenestines back into their city, and it seemed as though both sides were in for a siege. However, the Romans left only a force strong enough to keep the Praenestines trapped in their city. The rest of the army left with Titus, and marched on the towns and cities that were subordinate to Praeneste. 8 small towns were captured quickly before Titus and his army stormed Velitrae and took the city by force. The army, having completed its job, then marched back to Praeneste, likely ready to storm the city. However, upon their arrival, the Praenestrians surrendered to Titus, and the brief war was won. Titus returned to Rome in triumph. He carried a massive statue of Jupiter Imperator, which would be placed in between the shrines of Jupiter and Minerva. The Romans would further engrave the statue to include a message. Quote, "Jupiter and all the gods granted that the dictator, Titus Quinticus, should capture 9 towns." End quote. This essentially equated Titus's campaign to a god-given quest, and divinely sanctioned Rome's conquest of Praeneste and its subordinate towns. Titus would give up his command only 12 days after his appointment. Praeneste would again attempt to rise up in revolt the following year, 379, but would not succeed. Again, I think we are dealing with an account that may very well be broadly correct, but some of the details might be filler created by Livy. And that is where we will pause our examination for today. Rome had just successfully beat back 3 different revolts by the Latin cities. While you would think that would be good news, it was probably bittersweet for the Romans. Yes, they had won 3 conflicts, but these wars were more symptoms rather than the whole disease. In truth, most of Latium was getting a little antsy with how powerful Rome was becoming. They could see the writing on the walls. They were about to be annexed. And while some were probably fine with such a thing happening, others certainly were not. Join me next time as we review the next 2 wars of the Interlude before the culmination of them all, the Great Latin War. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. Let me know what you think about some of the new visual aspects of the video. They're not completely set in stone yet, and I'm still messing with them, so any advice or suggestions would be greatly appreciated. If you have any comments on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.